Hi, I'm John Rofrano for Boris TV, and welcome to the Boris Continuum Complete for Vegas Pro Training Series. In this episode, we're going to take a look at in-camera transition effects, in particular swish pan and lens blur. You may have noticed that I use swish pan on every one of these episodes to separate the titles from the main video. I just like the way it looks. It gives a little motion. I think the first time I saw a swish pan, and I'm going to be dating myself, was back in the 60s, either on a Man from U.N.C.L.E. Or a Get Smart series. But whenever they move from one place to another, they seem to use a swish pan to do it, and I thought that was really neat. And you may be saying, well, where am I going to use a swish pan today or lens blur today? And then I was watching a rather popular late night television show. So let me just show you the opening here and see if you can spot what I'm talking about. Here it is, and what was that? I believe that was a swish pan. Let's look at it again. Yep, sure enough, a swish pan. And if we go back and look at it, that may have been done in camera because it really is rotating the camera around. And that's what a swish pan is. That's what we call them, in-camera effects. And then as we follow this along, you know, there's some other effects going on. And then right about here, whoop, there's lens blur. Let's take a look at that. We'll back up a bit. And if you just look at how it's blurring, notice how bright those lights get. If it was a normal blur, the lights wouldn't be accentuated like that. So there are folks using swish pans and lens blurs all the time on TV. So let me show you how this is done. Swish pan is a transition. So I'm going to go to my Transitions tab, come down to BCC Swish Pan, and just drag and drop it onto transition that I've already made. And then we'll kind of zoom in here so we can see what's going on. So I'm going to RAM preview this, just so you can see the transition. Now this is only 15 frames, right? We're at 30 frames per second, so this is about half a second, because you want the swish pan to be pretty quick. So there's a swish pan, you know, adding some movement going from viewing the coastline to viewing these jet skiers. So let's see the different things we can do with swish pan once we have it applied. First, the animation could be either auto, or you can control it as a % done. I usually keep it at auto, but when you have % done, you're in control of the full swish. So this is going to, if I don't automate this, this is going to stay at 50% all the way across. So what you'd want to do if you go to % done, you're going to want to keyframe this, and then you're going to want to add a keyframe where it's at 0, and then another keyframe, you know, at the end where it's at 100 if you want to go all the way through. Actually, that didn't follow to 100 because I didn't move my cursor. Let me lock my cursor here and then move it to 100. And so now I've got the % done going from 0 to 100. So you could have full control over that, so that if you wanted to, in the middle, let's say, rather than have it be at 33% of I have here, I could have it come all the way over. I can come back down to this position, bring it all the way down, and now it's going to kind of jerk back and forth. So let's look at this. I'll do a RAM preview. So now I've got it going back and forth. Not sure why you would do that, but in some instance, you know, you might want to. So you've got full control over that. I'm going to change it back to auto for now, just way it automatically goes through the transition. The other thing we can do is animation tuning, and I really like this. I'm going to turn on this curve so you can see what's going on here. So I'm going to position my cursor in the middle of the transition here and view the ease curve. And now we can see what's going to be happening when we do the ease in and ease out. Ease in, as you would imagine, puts a little bit of a bend, so it slowly eases into the effect, and ease out does the opposite on the other side. It puts a little bit of bend, so it eases out of the effect. And this is more like a cameraman really would be, you know, if they were really doing an in-camera effect, the camera doesn't do a linear pan, and there's no way to do that, right? You know, it kind of, there's a little bit of drag before the pan starts, and then there's a little bit of drag as it ends. So this kind of makes it more natural. So let's turn it off and just look at that, and we'll do a RAM preview again. And not sure if you can notice, but it's kind of easing in and then slowing down at the end and easing its way out. So it's slowing down as it goes out and as it comes in. The other thing you can do, which I don't usually use, is to do the hold in and hold out. So this will hold the time at which the transition starts. So what's happening now is, as we, let me turn this off so you can see, there's no transition. Here I am, I'm entering the transition and nothing's happening because it's holding. Then it swiftly does the transition, and then I'm at the end. I'm not at the end, but it's still holding here as well. So for some reason, and let's RAM preview that so you can see how quick that is. If some reason you wanted to keep your media at the same transition length and you wanted to change the effect, you could, but it's just as easy to keep these hold in and outs the same and then just move the transition itself. But for some reason, if you didn't want to do that, you could use hold in and out. So that's kind of neat with this animation tuning, and I almost always like to go in there and do that ease because it makes it a little bit more natural. The other thing you'll notice is that we have a pan direction, and that defaults to left. So right now the pan is coming in on the left. I could switch this to right, and then the pan would go the other way. All right, so now it's pushing the coast off to the right and bringing on the jet skiers. Now you can also go top to bottom. So let's watch this in top mode. And actually what's happening here is a little more natural. The skiers are skiing in, so you might want to have it swish up like that, although a little tough to do a camera pan in that direction. And likewise, you can use bottom, and so it will swish from the top to the bottom. So now the incoming clip is pushing down on the outgoing clip. The next control controls the amount of blur. Let me set this in the middle, and we'll see. And I'm just going to put this back to left. The blur is normally at 100. You can back the blur down until finally there's no blur at all. It's just two clips butted up against each other. And here you can see what the swish pan is doing. It's really doing a push. So if we look at this, what's happening is, one video is pushing over the other, as you might expect. And so it's doing a push with an added blur. Now there's something interesting here in the separation. You can separate those two clips. So let me take the blur off, you see what's happening. It'll move the two clips out as it pans across, and of course you can still blur the edges of them. And so now you get something like this. And you might want to use that to have a reveal underneath. So let me add a video track here and just pull it down below. And maybe we will add a piece of text. So I'm going to go text media. Sorry that went off the screen, but I selected text media. And we'll just put the word motion in here. Maybe swish motion. And now what you'll see is happening. Let's RAM preview that. So you see what's going on is now there's a little reveal of text underneath. Or that could be some other visual that you maybe have a theme going through your movie and you want it to be some other kind of visual. Let's take the text, let's change it to a noise texture. And maybe make that noise texture the soft clouds. And then you can see the soft clouds coming through the bottom here. So kind of neat that you can actually separate this and get some interesting effects with the swish pan when you use the separation like that. I'll just close that back up and then we'll take a look at the blur extras. The blur extras are kind of neat. You can control the blur delay. So what happens is as it starts to move in, right, the blur immediately starts happening. So you can delay the blur. So if I add it, it will delay when it starts to blur. So now I'm in the effect and the push is happening, but the blur is not. If I move back a little bit, the blur is not happening yet and the push is. And then the blur happens and then it pushes back out again. So you can delay the blur, or more than likely you can pre-blur. So you can push it in the other direction and it will blur before it comes in. It'll start blurring, so you've got a nice blur to start off with, right? And that really gives you a good effect. Let me RAM preview that so you can see it. Kind of a really fast swish, but you have that capability of controlling the blur like that. I'll just reset this. The blur could be faster or smoother. You might want to put it on smoother when you're about to render and just leave it faster for when you're playing around with it. This next control controls how much motion blur is applied. So the motion blur is being applied in the direction of the motion. Since the direction is left to right, I have a horizontal blur going on here. If I were to take and change the direction to top to bottom and then use motion blur, you see I've got a vertical blur, right? So it's always going to blur in the direction of the motion. So you control how much of that you've got going on. There is a clip on the blur, so you can determine at what point the blur is going to reach 100%. So you can add, if you bring this clip all the way up, then the blur will reach the maximum right in the middle here, or you can bring it down and you won't get so much blur as it passes through. It won't blur quite as much. You can still kind of see the line there. Then there's this perpendicular blur. The reason it's called perpendicular is because if the blur is right to left, then it's going to blur top to bottom, perpendicular. So let me add a little bit of this. You can see it's now smoothing. Matter of fact, I'll shut the motion blur off totally, and you can see that it's going to blur up, down, right, in a vertical, because I've got it going horizontally. If I had the blur going top to bottom, then the perpendicular blur would blur horizontally, right? So it's the opposite of the motion blur, is the perpendicular blur. Just set that back. We'll put our motion blur back up. And then you've got some apply modes, and I usually use normal, but there is some really neat stuff in here. So the normal apply modes, you know, lighten, darken. One of my favorites is add down here, so you can get some nice stuff going on with this add blur. Really kind of neat effects going on. So there's lots of stuff you can do with playing with these, and then playing with the amount of mix, and actually you can mix back in the original to get exactly the effect that you want in the blur of the Swish pan. So that's Swish pan, kind of a handy thing. I like to use it a lot, and hopefully you will too now that you understand how it works. Let's move on to the lens blur. Now, I also use this lens blur, and I'm using the actual footage that I used in a previous webinar. So let me refresh your memory here by taking the project media from that webinar, and I'm just going to drop it on the top here. And this is one where I was doing the 3D text, and I needed something interesting behind my 3D text, but I didn't want these buildings to be too clear, right? So, you know, I want you to focus on this exploding text, and the buildings are kind of secondary. And so I wanted to place a blur on them, and what I used was, I used the lens blur. So the lens blur is, if you have your effects categorized, and in Vegas Pro 11, which I'm using now, they actually do get categorized for you. You can go to BCC Colors and Blurs, take the lens blur, and drop it down on here to get the lens blur. You can see right away it has a really nice effect, and it just kind of blurs out that background a little bit so that your eyes are focused on the foreground and not so much on the background. Now you might say, and let me delete this, just get out of our way. You might say, you know, why don't you just use a Gaussian blur? So let's go do that. Let's add a Gaussian blur and see what we get here. So again, we'll just open up the plugin chooser and go down to the BCC Gaussian blur, double click on that and add it. And now I'm going to turn off the lens blur so you just have the Gaussian blur. And watch what happens. And there are some really nice modes in Boris's Gaussian blur that's a lot nicer than Sony's, and we'll go into it maybe in another tutorial. But if I just add kind of, you know, a blur here, and we've got the horizontal and vertical locked, you can see it's really just blurring out the picture to nothing, right? It's not doing anything with the highlights, although the Gaussian blur does have the ability in Boris to do that. The one in Sony doesn't. So a simple Gaussian blur would just, you know, make the picture a little more blurry, but not very interesting. And so the lens blur gives it a more natural look. So let me eliminate this and go over back to the lens blur, and we'll turn that on. And you'll see how the lens blur is starting to affect the highlights. So the first thing I want to do is come down and increase the iris scale so you can really see what's going on with this blur, right? As the iris gets bigger, and we can also increase the gamma here so it becomes more pronounced, you can really start to see the iris blur happening here in the lens blur. So, you know, what's really happening in the lens is as you stop down a lens, the elements that are inside the lens start to affect the things that are out of focus. And so we're mimicking that here with the lens blur. There is this quality slider. You can start with fast, and this affects the edges. Normally you would use normal when you're going to render, but then you've got sharp and sharper, and it's really just affecting how sharp the edges are on that blur. In addition to just an overall iris scale, you have an individual. You can scale them wider or taller individually for some reason. But let me bump up the gamma here, keep the scale kind of large, and then show you what we can do with the iris, because there's some really nice stuff you can do with this blur. Now, one of the things that allows you to do is view the iris for working on just the iris. So if you click View Iris, it gives you an idea of what the iris actually looks like, and then you can see the actual size of it. I'm going to be turning that on and off to show you some of these different effects. The first thing we have under iris is the shape. So as I said, when the iris is wide open, the shape is more of a circle, and you start to get some size, you stop it down. But we can go through these and get some kind of strange stuff, like a 3-sided, or a 4-sided, or a 5-sided, or 6, which is the default. And then you can increase this for as many sides as you'd like, up to 16 sides in your iris, which kind of gets circular again. So let's go back to the 6 sides to show you some of the other effects. There is a curvature. As you curve it out, it gets more like a circle. As you curve it in, you can see it kind of gets more star-shaped. It's kind of pinching in those irises. And so if you were going to match a real lens blur, let's say with another shot that you had, where you had it put the lens blur in, you can use this to really match this up. Then you got the iris rotation, where you can rotate the iris. That's kind of nice to automate. And then you have the bouquet, which is a hollowing out of the iris. So as I bring that down, you can see the iris is hollowing out here. And it's easy to see this if I view the iris. You can see what's really happening here as I view the iris. And then you can control the shading within the bouquet, how much shading you want. So you really have tremendous control over what this iris looks like. The next section adds a little bit of noise. So sometimes there's some noise. I'll increase the noise intensity and then bring the scale up. And you can see the noise starting to come in here. And again, if I turn on the iris view, you can see the noise is being added to the iris. Maybe it's easier to show you here, where you can stretch the noise and you can blur the noise a bit. And you can change the noise seed, which is where the noise starts. And all of that, of course, is also affected as you change it in here. So that adds a little bit of noise, little character to the iris. I'll just shut that off and show you the highlights. Now for the highlights, let me make the iris a little bit smaller here. I'm going to scale it down a bit. And then we can see there's several modes. You can boost the RGB, RGB glow, boost the saturation along with using RGB, or you can use Luma, and you can use Luma boost to white, which is actually desaturating. So let me turn these boost highlights up. We'll show you these. So that was just Luma. This is Luma with the boost to white. This is RGB glow, which you can see more colors start to come in because it oversaturates it. And then RGB max, which is using the regular colors that are in there. And then there's a threshold for, how sensitive it is to adding these highlights. You can see here it's actually lighting up the sky. If I lower it, and then a suppressed threshold, which is actually going to darken the picture. So you can get some really nice effects here, right, with just these lights flickering with everything else dark by playing with these thresholds. And finally, there's a soften here to soften up those highlights that give you a little bit control of the softening. And then lastly, there is some post-processing. And again, there's a bunch of apply modes. You can do a lighten and a darken, all different apply modes. You get some really nice effects here by changing the apply modes. There's a difference. There's a lighter. Again, the add is one that usually gives you some nice effects here. So that's kind of really neat with the add mode. And then you can control the mix of the add mode to normal mode, right? All the way to the left would be normal, and then all the way to the right, it would apply this add mode. And then, of course, you can mix it with the original if you want to bring a little more of the original back in here. Right in that. We'll just set this back to normal, and we'll do some automation just to show you how you might want to use the iris control here. Now I'm just going to automate the scale. I'll bring the cursor back here to the beginning, and I'll increase the scale and then bring it in just a bit, maybe right to here, and then bring it down. And so you can control kind of some special effects there where maybe you've got it almost to the end, then we'll go back to the end and we'll bring it back up again. We start at 0, go to the end and bring it back up to 100, and then it'll start to blur out again. So that about wraps it up. Hopefully you have a better understanding of how lens blur and the swish pan works, and you'll start to use it in your productions. If you need more information, drop by boriseffects.com. This is John Rofrano for Boris TV. Until next time, thanks for watching.